Welcome to the Leaders in Payments podcast, where we talk to C-level leaders from across the payments landscape. We'll be discussing the products and services that impact the payment space today, as well as trends and predictions for the future of payments. We will also hear stories from our guests about their journeys to the top.
For us, it was all about, can we help accelerate the journey of traditional banks as they look to get more digital, as they look to serve their customers in different ways? Could we stand up the infrastructure that would help them leap into those spaces? So really the genesis behind Extend was really around how do we help banks liberate themselves from their older infrastructure, recognizing that it's very hard for them to switch providers. And therefore, how can we help to build out these digital capabilities over the top of their core?
That was Andrew Jamison, the CEO and co-founder of Extend, and he is our special guest this week. This is episode 83 of the Leaders in Payments podcast, and I'm your host, Greg Myers. And hey, before we get started, if you happen to office in Houston, Austin, or North Texas, check out Fuse Workspace, where their mission is to help others do more. Check them out at fuseworkspace.com. Okay, back to the show. Andrew spent his first 10 years of his career at SAP and then moved over to American Express for 12 years, where he managed all B2B payment solutions, including virtual card platforms and products. Andrew currently lives in New York City with his wife and two small children. In 2016, he started Extend with two partners. They raised a friends and family round to build their MVP and now are starting the process of raising $30 million in a Series B. As traditional banks look to compete in the digital world, Extend helps them to build out digital capabilities. Basically, an extension that builds or sits over their core technology and repackages what they have in ways that companies will use. They started with credit cards or virtual cards, as nearly every business has this need. Andrew has some great advice for those just starting their careers, and on a personal level, although living in New York City, he loves the outdoors and more specifically hiking. We've got a great episode today, so let's get started. Hi, Andrew. Thank you for being here, and welcome to the Leaders in Payments podcast.
Thanks for having me on the podcast, Greg. Looking forward to the discussion.
Yes, I am as well. So let's dive right in. Tell our audience a little bit about yourself, maybe where you grew up, where you went to school, where you currently live, a few things like that.
Perfect. That should take at least 1 hour, so we'll be in good shape.
Good.
I was born in the UK, but within 12 months, my parents had relocated to France. So French was pretty much my first language. I went to French school till I was 11. And my father's actually Australian and my mother's Swedish. So it was a healthy mix to the point when I was 11, I went to boarding school in the UK and had a very thick French accent. And so the Brits thought I was French. The French thought I was British. So it was an interesting and confusing time. But, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, as they say. But again, I really enjoyed it. There was much more exposure to the great outdoors life and sports. And that then took me on to university in the UK as well. That was the start, really, of my journeys around the world in terms of business and travel, because I joined a consultancy firm out of college. And that had me on an aircraft at what is probably the best time for someone to be out and about traveling, because you don't really have a care in the world. Everything's a voyage of discovery. And you have very little constraints around what you do. So it was a great way to be introduced to the working environment and practices. And again, I got a great apprenticeship there. So it's kind of a fun way to start the career.
Okay. And how did you get to the US?
So the US happened on two folds. After I'd sort of been in consulting for the best part of 8 years, focused on SAP, I then sort of realized that it was for me a bit of a rinse and repeat situation. Sure, you looked at companies and there were different companies, how you implemented them, but I sort of felt it was getting more repetitive. And so I chose to go and do an MBA as, for me, the best option to sort of think of a career change. So I went to INSEAD in France. And there I actually met my wife and now the mother of my two kids, and she's Korean American. And so we moved from INSEAD to London when we spent 2-3 years. But when I went back to London, I joined American Express. And the secret there is in the title. It was American Express and not European Express. So for someone who was very focused on product and really sort of product development and sort of the core parts of the capabilities, the backbone, so to speak, of the different capabilities American Express had, it was a natural transition for me to go where ultimately the core business was, the lion's share of the business is, and really where the dollars were as it related to products. So that's what gave me, between that and my wife being American and wanting to sort of come back to the US, really brought me over here. That was the beginning of the journey. That was back in 2006.
Okay, and that brought you to New York City.
That's right. The mothership here in downtown, in a financial district, just downtown in Manhattan. That's correct, yeah.
Okay. And you're still there today?
Still there today. It was meant to be I don't know, I think my wife and I decided it would be somewhere in the regions of 3 to 5 years. But sort of wind the clock forwards, and before you know it, you have a couple of kids and you start putting them through the schooling system. And suddenly, between 2 careers and a couple of kids in their schools, you sort of realize how actually you get tied down pretty quickly. So we chose to stay here. And again, it's been a great experience, and certainly probably a key part of how I even got to do a startup. I don't know why, but I look at a lot of the constraints around Europe around starting businesses, and I recognize that the US is a great place to start a business. And I think that partly gave me the courage to go ahead and build a business here. It's part of the fabric. It's actually part of the DNA, I feel, of Americans to be fairly fearless and fairly entrepreneurial around trying things. They may fail, but there's the appetite there for giving something a good try. And if you fail, you dust yourself off and you get up and you run again. And there's very little stigma associated with trying something and it failing. It's just a case of what did you learn and what do you take from that experience into the next experience. So for me, those are all important pieces, I feel, in terms of how then I thought about creating a business and trying to make a go of it.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Extend. That's the name of your company. So tell us what Extend does.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe the easiest way to describe what we do is to sort of give a little bit of background in terms of what I noticed in the industry. And part of that is linked to the fact that, I worked across the enterprise resource planning space with SAP and sort of got to understand infrastructure quite well. And then, interestingly enough, I sort of came to American Express and started to realize that the infrastructure that was supporting the banks and all of their associated businesses was really quite antiquated. They were still operating off mainframes. They're still operating off green screens. And I'd been somewhat horrified when I graduated in the early 90s that I was essentially working on a green screen with SAP. But within 18 months, the world had evolved there where we were operating off a Windows front end. And here I was some 20 odd years later being faced with these green screens. And it helped me understand a little bit more as to why there was challenges around innovation in the space. And so for us, it was all about, can we help accelerate the journey of traditional banks as they look to get more digital, as they look to serve their customers in different ways? Could we stand up the infrastructure that would help them leap into those spaces? So really Extend, the genesis behind Extend was really around how do we help banks liberate themselves from their older infrastructure, recognizing that it's very hard for them to switch providers. And therefore, how can we help to build out these digital capabilities over the top of their core? And so that's what we've done. We've gone and built really an extension, hence the name Extend. The whole idea was, let's build an extension that bridges or sits neatly over the top of their core infrastructure capabilities, but really repackages the capabilities that they have in ways that companies will want to use them, whether it's through digital and mobile capabilities. So that's what we've gotten done. And we started that journey with credit cards, and specifically with that digital distribution of credit cards with all of the controls that you can now really add to these cards. So the focus being on businesses who may want to give a credit card to an employee who maybe travels twice a year, right? And now since COVID's happened, there's little travel. It's all these folks who work from home and they still have to buy subscriptions. They have to make all sorts of purchases. But how do you enable that if you're not giving everyone a corporate card? And you don't necessarily want people to be digging into their own pockets. So that was the genesis behind some of the pieces we wanted to go after. But then with COVID, it straddled further, and we started getting more and more into B2B, which is how do you help companies manage tail spend? And again, as I mentioned, with the change in working practices, there has been just a greater need for digital payment capabilities, for embedded payment capabilities inside of different experiences.
Okay. And so the first product is basically virtual cards focused on the B2B space, right?
That is right. And I think more specifically, virtual cards really focused at that sort of middle market and small business, because virtual cards in themselves are not new. In fact, there were sort of two key players in this space. One was a company called Orbiscom, based out of Ireland in the late 90s. And another one was GE, that had a virtual card engine as a big engineering company with a lot of processes, in terms of purchase orders and having to marry up payments with purchase orders and having to reconcile all these different things. They were also at the forefront of this innovation. And I got firsthand experience of it because American Express bought GE's commercial card portfolio. And with it came this technology that we'd started to compete against with our traditional purchasing cards. But we suddenly very quickly realized that these digital cards with all these controls were a very powerful tool. And so we knew we needed to have that in our arsenal. And that was a key part of the decision in terms of acquiring their portfolio.
Okay. And so your customer is the actual financial institution. Is that correct?
That is right. We sell into banks for one part of our business, and the core part of the business for which people know us today. We absolutely sell into banks, and we enable capabilities that they can then offer to their clients and overlay with services they already have.
Okay.
Right. So just to give you an example, with our platform, there is a bank has a number of customers that will have a physical piece of plastic. And from that very physical piece of plastic, we enable them to really fractionalize the line of credit on it and really make it available to different employees, contractors, gig workers, suppliers, any number of these different parties in a transaction. We securely and safely enable that cardholder to say, I'm going to provision $1,000 for someone to go and make a payment. And again, really modeled more on a Venmo type of experience where it's a peer-to-peer type of solution versus requiring a company to go and do any form of implementation, installation of software. The whole point here is it's all about speed, efficiency, and removing friction from getting access to a form of payment for someone to make that purchase.
Okay. And how do you go to market? Through a direct sales force, or do you have partners, or how do you go to market?
So we work very closely with the issuers that we partner with. And we leverage the fact that they have an enormous sales force already out there that is already promoting cards. If you think of our solution as really an extension, it's a feature of an existing piece of plastic. It's not even a sales process. It's really about highlighting to your client base that there are just now new things you can do with a card you already have. That's a key component. So if you think of some of the big players out there who have millions of cards out there, what we really do is work with the issuer to make sure they can notify those clients that any one of those million customers can now leverage the Extend platform to go and send these digital cards. And we then play with them in terms of like, what are the industries that they support? And so how we best suit it to go to market depending on the industry verticals where they have strong penetration.
Okay. And how many employees do you have today?
So we grew from pre-COVID levels of being 15, and we founded the company in 2017. And so we grew, but frankly, we grew in a very disciplined fashion, just knowing that building infrastructure is something that takes time, and then dealing with financial service companies takes even more time. And so we just knew there was a certain number of things we needed to stand up before we really started scaling the business. So we were at 15 around that sort of February, March of 2020. And today we are 30. So really over the course of COVID, we've really doubled down. And largely we've doubled down because the banks themselves have recognized that they needed to double down on abilities to send, to create opportunities for their clients to send digital cards. And so as you can imagine, with people not going into offices, with people not traveling, there's just been this tremendous need for making things available to people really instantly and with as little friction as possible, because in many of these businesses, people have continued to operate at a home fairly successfully. But the challenge was they're no longer in the office. And so again, you need digital ways to give people access to things. And that we became an essential part of that journey.
Okay. What would you say differentiates your company from your competitors out there?
Look, it's an interesting one because it's really about defining who our competitors are. We, as I said, we service the traditional banks with these digital card capabilities. So a lot of these banks, whether it's the likes of Amex, Chase, Wells Fargo, right, they will compete head to head in that middle market segment against the likes of the Divvies, the Ramps, the Brex of this world, who stood up their platforms on more modern processors, the likes of a Marqeta and I2C, right, as platforms. that inherently had the capability to distribute digital cards. And so they've aggressively come after the market because they recognize that that middle market segment needed this flexibility, right? That ability to instantly issue, that ability to have a hierarchy of card members that you could see and influence in a matter of seconds. And so we essentially decided to say, okay, well, if the businesses need those capabilities, there has to be a player in there that can come in and build that infrastructure out. And that's where we came in. We recognized that traditional banks couldn't just go and implement a more modern processor because their existing processor, albeit a little bit older, had a plethora of capabilities, right? And had a resilience and really some performance metrics that any of these emerging players would struggle to keep up with. And more importantly, these platforms were incredibly embedded into the core capabilities of the banks, which is underwriting, risk management, servicing, remittance. All these things essentially are really how a bank ticks and operates every day. And so it's not a case of, I just need to have a modern piece of software. That software has got to have its tentacles into all these different other supporting platforms that hold up my business.
Yeah, I love that. I don't know if it's a tagline or a headline on your website. I don't know that I'll remember it exactly, but something like, if legacy bank systems talk to each other, we wouldn't be here today.
That's true. And I think the challenge that these traditional banks have is, what they've built is tremendous scale. If you think of the card industry today, in commercial is about 1.5 trillion in the US alone. Let's be honest, that is tens of millions of people with cards out there today. And it's the envy of every company. So from our perspective, what we felt was people don't need a new card. And the reality is cards in some cases are more and more commoditized, as you can see by the rewards that continue to increase every time you take up a new card. What people needed was a card that could do more, a card that gave more control, especially in the context of businesses, where CEOs, CFOs keep a very tight line on essentially what people can go and buy over what period of time. And so that's what we said about orchestrating was just simply a better way for companies to be able to distribute access and really make sure that these banks, these traditional banks, could compete more effectively in this increasingly digital age. So essentially, so as to retain their customers and add new customers to their portfolios.
And when you talk about banks, is there a certain segment? Like, is it not the real small, but not the real big? It's kind of in between?
So look, that's a really interesting question. The way that I look at it is, it's more about go-to-market than who needs it. Because credit cards are used from the smallest individual to the biggest corporations, right? Because they're actually a very flexible tool and a tool that creates trust between two parties that really don't know each other, right? A card member and a merchant essentially only know each other because of the card networks, right? And they create a trust ecosystem. And so it's about leveraging that ecosystem and making that ecosystem, bigger than it already is today to create a degree of trust. But now you've put in place controls that allow the card member to have total insight, total control over who has access to a card, what they're buying, when they're buying it. And those are really key things for modern businesses today. But if you think of, could this be applicable in the consumer world? Absolutely. In fact, we have many banks asking us already today, when are we going to make these capabilities available in consumer? Because parents have kids going to colleges. Parents have nannies who essentially they need to give a card account because they need to fill up the car with gas, or they need to go and buy some groceries. And then there's family members overseas who today have to use Western Union and other forms of payment that are expensive for them to move money around, when frankly what they needed was just access to an account that they could go and charge. And in today's world, where more and more is done through contactless means, it means actually physical plastic is less and less relevant. And so really digital facilitates so many different things that couldn't be done in the past. So to answer your question, our focus today is very much on the middle market and small business, because that's where we see both the biggest immediate need, but also where we see people who can make an instant decision to use the product. We know that over time, we will also scale into large and enterprise. But in the same way as contracting with a large bank takes a long time, contracting with large customers takes a long time. So we're very focused on making sure that we make our services available to those who are going to consume it the fastest. And it's going to be those mid-market small business owners who will make an instant decision to use the platform and therefore give us a scale we need to then have the time to be able to then bring in the bigger clients. And the same approach, it's fair to say that when we think of onboarding banks, we have a dual strategy, which is the smaller regional banks will move faster, right, by definition, than the bigger banks. And so we have onboarded, 2 of the 5 biggest issuers here in North America, and one of those announcements is about to come out in the next month. But we're extremely excited because they own essentially a third of the market. And so that's really key for them to become a partner because now we're relevant, right, across the ecosystem. And we can touch already close to 50% of the overall existing ecosystem of people who have an account, have a card, and are spending today versus having to build it from the ground up ourselves.
Right. Makes sense. I think all of that's a good segue into the next question, which is really, where do you see this heading? Where do you see payments heading, or maybe answer from your segment of the payments industry? Where's it heading in the next 2 to 3 years?
That I'm looking at the broader ecosystems. I'm always trying to find where are the parallels where something like this has happened before. And for me, it's already happened in the industry I used to be in, which is the enterprise resource planning space. There were a lot of players in that space, and to some degree there still are. But if you think of the likes of Oracle and SAP became the 2 sort of predominant players, and Oracle went through an acquisition strategy where it bought Siebel as a CRM system. They went and bought JD Edwards, and they went and bought a ton of different players to try and really monetize the license revenue. On the other hand, what you had was SAP, which sort of doubled down and said, I'm going to be the core for all of the transactions across as many businesses as I can. And I think today SAP touches a phenomenal percentage of any transaction, because somewhere along the line, someone who manufactures a product uses SAP. And what I've realized is the same will happen in the financial services world. And we started seeing that in 2019, really, with Global Payments going ahead and buying TSYS. And then you see the different mergers that have happened and acquisitions that have happened, with both FIS and First Data being essentially now consumed into bigger, broader organizations. So again, consolidation of core capabilities, both across card and core banking. And I think once that consolidation settles down, what you're going to see is, in the same way that SAP then went out and picked off best of breed players, right, where they went and bought Concur, they went and bought Ariba, I think you're going to find these bigger entities are going to start to go out there and try and find best of breed capabilities to really help them move and accelerate their own innovations journey, recognizing that they have the core, but maybe not the digital assets that they need. And I think that's where this ecosystem in the payments world is going to get really interesting, is to sort of figure out which API businesses are going to be right at the heart of powering a lot of these new companies who want to embed payments, right? And so the interesting parallels there again are the likes of Plaid, who did it from a data perspective and now sit there and power a lot of new businesses. I think the way we look at it is more and more people are going to want to embed the ability to distribute cards into different ecosystems. And we essentially want to be the fabric that's right there, connected to multiple banks and connected to a broader fintech world, so that we essentially became that single gateway, that one exchange through which those card accounts can flow securely but freely.
Okay. Do you think those players are the FIS and Fiservs of the world, or do you think they're the Googles and the Facebooks of the world?
Oh, look, I think those players are going to come in thick and fast, and start to compete, because I agree with you. And especially in a world where we sit in a technology world, we don't issue cards, we don't underwrite as a business. But when you look at the Googles, the Facebooks, the SAPs, all of them have certainly turned an eye towards getting closer to the financial services ecosystem. I don't think it necessarily means that they want to become a bank and they want to underwrite. I think initially, I think what they'll do is figure out ways of going and getting broader access to that ecosystem. And so I think that the interesting one there is Apple that went and launched its own card. But actually, if you think of the underwriting there, it's really happening through Goldman. So again, they want to be part of the ecosystem, but they don't want to bear the financial risk. And so when we look at what we do as a business, we see absolute relevance in what we do with what the likes of Google, Facebook, Apple, SAP are all trying to do.
Okay. Well, let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about you and your journey to your role there. You've already talked a little bit about your background and at Amex and kind of learning about the space there. So maybe talk through how you got from Amex, big corporate America, to entrepreneur.
Well, that wasn't a design journey in any way, shape, or form. And I know people who know me know this is an important part of my journey, which was I actually left Amex in the back end of 2015 with no intention whatsoever to create a startup. I actually left for personal reasons related to my mother's health. And so went back to Europe for a period of time. And by the time I came back some 14 months later to be ready to rejoin the workforce, it was really about, did I want to go back with established players? But like everything, when you take time out for good or bad reasons, right, you just have time to think. My mind wasn't impeded with, I still have a project I need to conclude. No, my mind was fairly free from a work perspective, and it allowed me to really start thinking about different ways that different products could be used relative to how they are used today. And what happened over that period of time is I developed an itch. I developed an itch that I really felt that by the time I came back, I actually decided I wanted to scratch. And that was about, recognizing that traditional banks had virtual cards, but they could only sell them to their biggest customers because it was really a case of it took an implementation team. It literally took a village to get a solution up and running. And yet you looked across the fence and what you saw is the new and emerging players that I mentioned earlier who are powered by more modern processors were sort of building up their programs in a heartbeat. None of this, it's going to take 2 to 3 months to deploy this product. I'm deploying it in 15 minutes. And so the itch was, what if we could actually recreate that environment where from an existing card, I could get you up and running in not 15 minutes, but 5 minutes. And so once I'd sort of figured out that was actually a possibility, and also once I recognized that I actually had a couple of partners who would actually take me to the finish line, because trying to do this on your own, I have utmost respect for entrepreneurs who go out this and do it alone. And that would not have been for me. I was fortunate in that my wife had a very long-standing friend here in New York City who became a close friend. And actually I'd done a bit of work with him at American Express. I'd brought him in for a project. And when he said to me, we should do this together, and I knew that he had a background in tech and in design, and so that's when Danny turned around and said, we should do this together. I sort of felt a bit of confidence because I could be Finn, he was definitely tech. And look, I could talk the game of technology through my work at SAP, but I really did not know how to make it happen. And so that was a critical component. But then the more we started planning, the more Danny and I started scratching our heads around, hang on, how are we going to manage all of these 27 work streams that are developing in front of us? And that's where we were extremely fortunate, where timing just happened to be right, where someone I'd worked with at American Express was really trying to think of what new opportunity as they were going to go after. And we tapped on Guillaume to help us and help define what the strategy would look like, what our messaging would look like. And the more he sort of dug in and helped us with presentations we were taking to Money 2020 and to different industry conferences around the cards payment world, the more he sort of became entrenched in wanting to be part of this journey. And the more we realized how much we needed someone as that third leg of the stool that would create stability, but importantly, where we had no real overlap in skill set. And so once we sort of had those foundational pillars together is when we kind of set out and said, okay, if we're going to make a go of this, we better go and raise some friends and family money so that we can actually get an MVP out the door. So that was really back end of 16, beginning of 17 is kind of when we started to stand up the bones of Extend. I think we incorporated in the second week of April of 17. And that's when we went headlong into, okay, we're gonna make this into a business.
Okay. And you've done a Series A, right?
That's right. We did our seed in October of 17, after we'd raised 250,000 really from 10 friends and family members who gave us a jump start. And we had pretty clear instructions from our wives, all three of which had worked in finance in their times, who basically were quite explicit. It's one thing you putting your own salaries on the line and sort of trying to say, okay, let's roll the dice. But at some point we can't also be the ones who fund this. And so they were again, we had to find people who would back us. And actually now I understand why also venture capital has a real focus on make sure you got friends and family who can back you first, because at least then people know that it's meaningful. And so what it allowed us to do was to build the MVP with that $250,000, specifically hiring back-end engineers. That allowed us then to actually go into Point 72 and others to actually show them what you could do with digital credit cards. And I think in our particular case, we'd gone to the local bakery up in Greenwich, bought some cakes that we brought to the meeting with actually one of the digital cards we'd created, so a live MVP, and essentially bribed them with cakes. And look, they eventually became our seed investors, and then they co-led our Series A some 18 months later with FinTech Collective as the co-lead on that particular round when we raised an additional 11 million.
Okay. And are there future funding rounds that you can talk about?
Actually, yes, and it's just kicking off right now. So having signed really one of the biggest deals that we could have hoped to sign in really the last 10 days, and having made traction across a secondary line of business that we have in terms of powering and embedding payments into other experiences, particularly in the buy now, pay later space, we felt that now was the right time, right? We had enough capital from the 11, if you think of everything we raised just shy or just over $15 million. We had enough capital to take us through the end of the year, but we now got ourselves into a place where we have too many initiatives ongoing. And so the danger is now we have plates that are spinning that are going to drop. And so we decided on the back of signing these big deals that now was the time for us to go into the marketplace. So we're just kicking off a process now to raise $30 million to really take us through the next chapter, the next phase of this journey, which actually is phenomenally exciting just by virtue of the speed at which we're seeing some of these different initiatives grow.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, what's something that you're passionate about? So maybe choose one thing in your personal life and one thing business-wise that you have a lot of passion for.
So look, one of my passions has always been that sort of practical, pragmatic thing of wanting to do meaningful things that I could actually wrap my head around, practically speaking. And so whenever I went and designed and built products and capabilities, whether it was at SAP, whether it was at Amex or here, for me, it's what I love is sort of getting into the nitty gritty of actually how would it work, and not just on a 3x2 matrix, but actually sort of like having a deep understanding of how things would be wired together. I consider that to be one of my competitive advantages out there is the fact I've never been shy to roll out my sleeves and get into the dirty tech, because for me it's been interesting to understand where things break down. I think on a business sense that stood me well and differentiated me often actually in my time at Amex. And again, it's something that serves me incredibly well now as we look to scale the business and really try and understand what are the customer challenges that you're trying to solve for. And that's really exhilarating in my mind is you identify a problem, you fix it, and then you start to see the ramifications of fixing that problem in terms of what it does to your business. And that to me is tremendously exciting and a powerful motivator for me and the team as a whole. And then maybe on the personal side, look, I have, despite living in Manhattan, I have a tremendous love of the outdoors. I'm a really big hiker. I love trekking. It's an area for me where I really feel that you have a freedom to think, a freedom to just really explore different things as you sort of walk around different parts of the world. And I've been fortunate in that I've spent 2 different years of my life backpacking across different parts of the world. And really sort of, for me, that's been really eye-opening, especially as you go to some of the poorer parts of the world where you really see people embrace you with open arms and bring you into their families and cultures. And for me, that's been very enriching. And so, the more remote the places, the better it is. And whether it's areas of Nepal or India or China that I've so essentially gone traveling around, or areas of South America, I've always made a point for me of really getting out there and getting a backpack and just, setting off into the wilderness. I've always really enjoyed that. That's been something that's been part of me. And maybe another reason why I love skiing as well is it's again the same thing, right? You're out there pretty much focused on Mother Nature.
Right. Awesome. So tell our audience what your advice would be for, say, someone coming right out of college and they're looking at fintech as a career path. What would you tell them they need to do to be successful?
Look, and for me, I take a leaf out of my own book. I know when I came out of college, I had the choice of going into a strategic consultancy, one of the top 3, or a choice of joining this startup, which, in essence, it's a fintech in a way because we were implementing SAP and SAP was relatively new. I was employee number 52 and we grew to 700 in 5 years, completely organically. And so the advice my father had always said to me is like, make sure whatever you do, you learn a practical set of skills, right? Skills that will stay with you for a lifetime. And for me, what I realized, the skill that I learned really was around that practical side of things, right? You deploy SAP when you actually understand a business, or at least that's how you do it successfully, right? You need to understand the guts of a business, how a financial process works. What does it take to get a payment out the door? How do you ledger transactions? All of these were key skills in my mind to sort of really get my head around, right? What are the different things that make a business tick? And that's the advice I tend to give people is, use those first 5 to 10 years as just a tremendous training ground. And I think my wife, who's a CFO and used to be a banker, has a similar philosophy, which is, look, she went into investment banking and she learned how to do modeling and all these different things. She did it for 2 years and it just wasn't for her. The industry wasn't for her as a whole. But again, it sort of now she sort of became over time, she went off to become a CFO. And it's the same thing. She learned core skills in those early years that she could then bring with her and continue to enrich over time to really then have all the foundational pieces to really be able to move up the line. Now, maybe it's not the inspirational things that people want to hear, right? Which is, no, you should just get out there and build your business. But it's, the more I look into it, the more I look at the stats, right? A lot of these entrepreneurs tend to set up their businesses, right, in their sort of 30s, 40s when they have some experience under their belt. And sure, there are folks who created businesses out of the garage or out of a dorm. But the reality is, those are the unicorns out there, right? If you think of America's small businesses, most of them are created with folks who had that sort of level of experience. And the other thing I would say is, for those folks who are out there is don't be afraid to try different things, right? We're not married to companies for life. And I think, I stayed really with 2 companies before I created Extend. And I look back and I sort of think, okay, there was a point in time when I was pretty comfortable and I should probably have challenged myself to go and try different things. But again, hindsight's a wonderful thing. And I think, no one should ever be afraid of trying something. Now, obviously, when you have a family, you have different constraints and those different things. But in those early years, there's very few constraints. And that's the fun part of engaging in business is how quickly can you learn and suck up the information and start to be able to interpret in such a way that you get insights as to the way you could do things differently.
Yeah, I think that's some great advice. Well, Andrew, we've covered a lot of ground about you and the company and your journey and the industry as a whole. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, look, I think it's to your point. I encourage all these folks to get out into this world. I think we've just barely scratched the surface of what fintech will do in the coming 10 years, and so I think it's a really exciting space. So I strongly encourage folks to get out there. There's so many interesting aspects to it. And many of them will create really better outcomes for a lot of people. So again, I think it's an exciting space. So very much looking forward to keeping my finger on the pulse because things are moving pretty fast. So anyway, I just want to say thank you for having me on the show and really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on the show. I know your time's very valuable, so I really appreciate you being here.
No, it's been a pleasure. Been great. Thank you.
Thank you. And to all you listeners out there, I thank you for your time as well. And until the next story.
Thank you for joining us this week on the Leaders in Payments podcast. Make sure you visit our website at leadersinpayments.com, where you can subscribe to the show and where you'll find our show notes. If you enjoyed listening, please share on your social channels as well.